Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Nun Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Shulamit Tyberg Isaacs in honor of her daughter, Dr. Shifra Tyberg. Happy birthday. May your life continue to be enriched by your Torah study, and may the blessings continue with much love, Mommy and Kim. And in memory of Pinchas Mordechai ben Reuven Moshe, who passed away tragically this week, by his brother-in-law and sister-in-law, by Moshe and John Klempner. He was a tzaddik with a pure soul who lived a life of chesed and mitzvot with absolute joy. Very apropos today, we'll be talking about the joy of the Simchat Beit HaShoeva and how unique that was. Before we start, also one quick announcement about the Siyum. If you haven't heard about it yet, we're having a Siyum on the go. We'll be sending out links on Wednesday morning. Wednesday morning is the Siyum. We will, Bezrat Hashem, be finishing. Anyone who wants to join the Zoom, on the live Zoom at 7:10 a.m. Israel time, we'll be finishing together and do the Hadrons together in the morning. And then after that, everyone will be sent a package of a number of different shiurim by Yael Ziegler and by, I'm never good with this, well, I'm about to teach the daf, my head is always in a million places, and Dr. Shana Schick. And there'll be the regular, right, I guess, no, that's in the English and the Hebrew, there'll be a bunch of shiurim as well. If you want to get the Hebrew, you can, I guess, it'll be on, everything will be on the website. There'll be a special page with all of the Siyum stuff as well. So you can also go on the Hebrew side if you get the links only in English. I guess we'll probably send links to both, to all the groups. If you're on the WhatsApp groups, if you get our emails, if you don't yet get our emails and you want to get our emails, you can go on the site and register, subscribe to get emails, and then you'll receive it. So that's for our Siyum. It'll be a bit of a different kind of Siyum. After that, just to remind everyone, we have 6 Masechtot in 6 months. So it's a good time. If you have friends who want to join, you can quickly do 1 Masechet, do 2 Masechtot. It'll be one after the other, and we'll have a lot of different Siyumim. So this one will be unique Sukkah Siyum on the go. Okay. We're going to start now back where we finished yesterday. If you recall, we had this whole issue about the Mishnah. Let's just start from the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said the Chalil is taken 5 or 6 days, and this is the Chalil of the Beit HaShoeva, which doesn't override Shabbat. We'll see this later, how this is the Chalil of Beit HaShoeva, which seems to imply it's different from a different type of Chalil. And that's where we get to this other Braita that says that there's a machloka between Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda and the rabbis about whether the Chalil is Dochesh Shabbat or isn't Dochesh Shabbat. So in our Mishnah, we saw it doesn't override Shabbat. But in this Braita, we see that Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda thinks it is. So either he disagrees with the Mishnah, or we saw Rabbi Yosef who said, no. He's talking about a different Chalil, the Chalil that we take 12 times a year that goes with the Korban, that we play the Chalil when we sacrifice the Korban. That's not the same Chalil as the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. So he says, the debate that between Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, whether it overrides Shabbat or not, has to do with the sacrifice, not the Chalil, the flute that was played during the celebrations of the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. And then he would say, clearly, everyone agrees that in the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, that certainly wouldn't override Shabbat. And what does he say? Why would it potentially override Shabbat when you do the sacrifice? It all depends on whether you say the Ikar Shira, the major part, the importance of the singing is the musical instruments or is the singing part. And then the question becomes, if you say the main part of the singing is actually the musical instruments, then it would override Shabbat because that's the avodah. It's part of the sacrificial rites. If you say it's just accompaniment, then it's not going to override Shabbat. That was Rav Yosef. So the first thing we're going to do in today's daf is suggest, Rav Papa is going to suggest, Amar Rav Papa at the very bottom of the last daf, Kitinai. This topic that he talks about is actually machlokat tanaim. Is Ikar Shira b'peh or Ikar Shira b'lev? After we then get off on a dissenting opinion to Rav Yosef, at the end, we're going to go back and actually, which probably should have started with, is where did they get it from? What verses can we see that Ikar Shira would be b'peh, by singing, or would be by musical instruments? That will be at the bottom of Nun Aleph Amud Aleph. For right now, we're going to try to show that maybe it's a debate between Tanaim. Titania, Avdei Kohanim ayu divrei Rabbi Meir. Okay, before we're kind of like mid-sentence here. So it's actually not a Titania, it should be Ditnan. It says in the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the Mishnah in Erechim, chapter 2, Mishnah 4. It says there, whole discussion there about who were the ones who did who played the musical instruments in the temple. So the first opinion is Rabbi Meir. Avdei Kohanim hayu. They were Canaanite slaves of the Kohanim. Very strange to think that they were the ones doing the musical instruments. But again, it all depends on how significant you thought it was. Obviously, Rabbi Meir didn't think it was so significant because even the Canaanite slaves of the Kohanim were able to be the ones who played the musical instruments. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Mishpachat Beit HaPgarim u'Mishpachat Beit Tzipraya u'Me'amum hayu shayu mesi'in l'kuna. It was from the family. There were two families, the Beit HaPgarim, the Pgarim family and the Tzipraya family, and they came from Amaum, which was a place in the current, they say it's called Amaus, and it was somewhere outside of Jerusalem. What's the importance of knowing who these families were? Well, they were mesi'in l'kuhuna. They had good yichus, okay? They had good genealogy. They were from families that could marry Kohanim. There's always an issue. Kohanim can only marry certain stock. They were families that had pure lineage that didn't come from, the main thing is, they can't come from Avadim. Okay, if there's lineage of Avadim in the family, Canaanite slaves, then it's a problem. Rabbi Chanina ben Antugunus Omer, Leviim hayu, third opinion. They were Levites who played the musical instruments. So the question is, what does this have to do? In other words, Rav Papa tried to bring this to say, this is all based on the machloket. Ikar shira bepeh or ikar shira bekli. So my love, is this not the root of the machloket? Demanda amar avadim hayu kasavar ikar shira bepeh. The ones who say it was Canaanite slaves, of course, you'd have to say, the main part of the shira is the voices. So therefore, the music was just an aside, therefore anyone can do it. But the ones who said the Levites had to do it, the Levites are in charge of Shiur in the temple. They're the ones who do the singing. So if they're the ones in charge of the music, and the music includes, then you'd have to say, only Levites can do it, means that Ikar Shira B'Kli, that the main thing, right? It's not that the Levites were the ones who had to sing, also sing maybe, but the musical instruments are such a critical part that also that had to be done by the Levites. So kasavari karshira b'kli. But now what's the problem? That only explains two of the opinions. What about the middle opinion? He doesn't make any sense, to which the Gemara is going to say, and as according to this machloket. V'tizbera, you really think that that's the machloket? The root of the machloket, the root of the debate? Rabbi Yossi, my kasavar. Then what is Rabbi Yossi, the in-between opinion that says it was these families that had good lineage? Ikasavar ikar shira bepeh, if Rabbi Yossi holds, really, it's bepeh, with the singing, not with the musical instruments. Then afilu avadim nami. Then he should allow also Canaanite slaves. And if he says the main singing is with instruments, Leviim in Yisraelim lo, then you can't have Yisraelim do it. It would have to be Levites. So in the end, his opinion makes no sense according to either approach. Therefore, the Gemara says, everybody thinks that really you could do, the main thing is with the voices. Anyone theoretically could play the musical instruments. But the root of the machloket has to do with this. It was just a debate in terms of what actually transpired in the temple. Who were the ones who actually did it? Not who is allowed to do it, but what actually happened. And we've seen this many times. There's a debate about the reality in the temple, what really went on. And that's what they're discussing. Now, you might say, what's the difference, right? Which is exactly what the Gemara is going to ask. L'may nafkamina. What's the relevance of who are the ones who actually did it? Why would that matter? So here is a very important nafkamina, which is l'ma'alin miduchan liyuchsin u'lamaser kamiflage. They were always worried about yuchsin in those days. Nowadays also, right? It's one of the biggest questions, right? How do you prove you're Jewish to get married, especially in this country, right? It's a big issue, and truth is anywhere really, which is, you go to get married and the rabbi checks out, before he marries you, who's Jewish, who's this, right? Anyway, also it was a big issue then. And the question is, when you see someone doing something, can you infer something about what their yichus is based on what they're doing? So if you hold that if you hold that the Levites were the ones who did it, then you'd know by seeing someone play, that they played the musical instruments in the temple, you'd know without having to check what their yichus was. Okay, that they were a Levi. And if they were Avadim Knaanim who did it, then you would know that they were Avadim Knaanim, and then you couldn't marry them off to a Kohen. So it's relevant in terms of, we're going to see two issues. Number one, for marriage. Number two, for Maaser. Why Maaser? The Maaser was the 10th of the produce that people would give to the Levites. Now, again, that's something where you have to know, is someone a Levi or not? So again, if we say it was the Levites who did play the musical instruments, then you would know that you can give Maaser to this person, because, right, you take your 10th, and then what do you do with it? Right, nowadays, we don't do anything with it. But in those days, you had to give it, you had to find a Levi. So how would you know? Well, one of the ways you would know is if it's the Levites who play the musical instruments, then you'd know, oh, I saw him playing musical instruments, I know he's a Levi. I can give him my Maaser. So now they're going to go through each one. Manda amar avadim ayu, if you say it was slaves who did it, kasavar, then he would obviously hold that you can't take someone. I didn't, by the way, explain what the duchan is. The duchan was the stand. Those were the steps that the Levites stood on when they sang, and whoever then, I don't want to say Levites, but whoever played the musical instruments stood there. So if you saw someone on the duchan, you can't then say, oh, I know he can marry a Kohen because he could likely be a slave. And also he wouldn't be able to get the Maaser. You can't give him your 10th of your produce. Manda Amal Yisrael Hayu Kasavar Ma'alim Miduchan Liyuchsin Avalo Maaser. If you say they were Yisraelim, then you know, and they came from these families that had good lineage, then you know that you could marry them to Kohanim, but you wouldn't be able to give them your Maaser. Umanda Amar Levim Hayu, obviously, Kasavar Ma'alim Miduchan Liyuchsin Ben Liyuchsin Ben Lamaser. For both purposes, we can assume everyone knows they're Levites, therefore they can get the Maaser and they can marry a Kohen. Okay. Now we're going to get to our big debate with Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef again, and I put this in the chart, Rav Yosef said, the debate is about the Shiur of Korban. Again, we're starting with this debate in the Braita between Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, who says the Chalil overrides Shabbat, against the rabbis who say it doesn't override Shabbat. And then we want to compare it to our Mishnah, which said the Chalil doesn't override Shabbat. So it seems, right, what Rabbi Yosef says is the Braita doesn't disagree with our Mishnah. The Braita is talking about a different situation, the Chalil of the sacrifice rather than the Chalil of the Simchat Beit HaShoeva celebration. But comes Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, and he says, no, machloket b'shir shel shoeva, in which case you would have to say that Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, who permits the Chalil on Shabbat, disagrees with our Mishnah. Okay, which doesn't bother us because we could say our Mishnah only holds by one opinion of one of the Tanaim, which is the rabbis, and he just didn't mention Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda's position. So he says, machloket b'shir shel shoeva, de Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda savar. Now, why would he say that in Simchat Beit HaShoeva you're allowed to play musical instruments? Right? It seemed crazy. You have a party on Shabbat so you can play musical instruments because you're having a big celebration. Well, what did it say? He felt that the extra happiness here in the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, and again, this isn't like a party in someone's house. This is a party celebrating, a big celebration in the temple that will override Shabbat as well, so you can play musical instruments. But Rabbanan Savre Simcha Yitera Ina Dochet Shabbat. This extra simcha, it's extra, it's not any essential part of any mitzvah. It doesn't override Shabbat. Now, if you say that, then what would they hold about the Shiur of Korban? If their debate is about the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, then he would say, Aval b'shir shel Korban divrei hakol avodah hi v'docha et HaShabbat. But when it comes to the Shiur of the sacrifice, where Rav Yosef said that's the debate, says nobody has a debate about that. Everybody agrees. Now, this is what I guess probably you'd have to say. Ikar shira b'kli. That's part of the essential part of the service. Or even the truth is probably, even if you say Ikar shira b'peh, if we're going to allow it to override in a Simchat Beit HaShoeva, or at least there's a debate about that, when it comes to the Korban, everyone will agree that it can override. Comes a Meitive. Meitive is a question from a Tannaitic source on an Emora. This time our question is going to be not on Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, but we're going to have a question now on Rav Yosef. Shiur shel shoeva dochet HaShabbat. We're now going to have another Braita about them debating. Now, if you notice, in the Braita we saw yesterday, it just said HaChalil dochet HaShabbat. It didn't say what Chalil, what we're referring to. Here it says Shiur shel shoeva. Notice it doesn't use the word Chalil, but it talks about the song of the shoeva, which seems to imply right? Singing is not something that's forbidden to you on Shabbat, so it must mean playing musical instruments. Shir shel shoeva, remember what Rabbi Yosef said. Rabbi Yosef said nobody thinks shir shel shoeva overrides Shabbat, and Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba said there's a machloket. Well, this is going to prove Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, because it says shir shel shoeva doche et haShabbat, divrei Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, v'chachamim omrim af yom tov eino doche. So what do you see here? The debate is about shir shel shoeva in this braita, which is exactly where Rabbi Yosef said that no one debates, no one permits it. So tiyuvta de Rabbi Yosef tiyuvta. So this seems to knock out his opinion because it's hard for him to explain that they don't argue about Simchat Beit HaShoeva, about the Chalil there. Now they say not only does it seem to knock out Rav Yosef about what he says, and Rav Yosef says two things. He says when it comes to Shir Shel Korban, there's a debate. When it comes to Shir Shel Shoeva, they all agree. So this disagrees with number one, Shir Shel Shoeva, they all agree. It's clearly they don't all agree because it says not. And we're now going to suggest that maybe it doesn't say anything about sacrifice in this braita, but they're going to infer that if they debate the issue of shoeva, they all agree about korban, in which case we're going to have a question against Rabbi Yosef on two issues. Number one, on the shoeva, and number two, on the korban, because again, we're going to say the korban, everyone agrees, and he said the korban, there's a debate about. So that's what they're going to say right now. Lema, let us suggest that if you look in this braita and it says b'shir shel shoeva hu depligi, it seems to imply they're only debating in a shir of the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Aval b'shir shel korban divrei hakol doche et haShabbat. But when it comes to the sacrifice, everyone would agree that it overrides Shabbat. Otherwise, it would have said so in the braita. It would have said shir shel shoeva v'korban, right? But it didn't say that. In which case, lema tavatiyuvta de Rav Yosef b'tarte. This disagrees with Rabbi Yosef about two things. I made charts in the sheet about all this so you could kind of see how it goes. So each time the question is, what's the debate? So according to this, if the debate, again, Rabbi Yosef says, that's like the first little chart I put on the page about Rabbi Yosef, korban, disagreement, shoeva, all agree. This says shoeva, disagreement, korban, they all agree. So it disagrees on both issues with him entirely. So Amar Lecha Rabbi Yosef could answer, the fact that the brightest mentions shoeva doesn't mean they didn't disagree about korban, and then at least it minimizes the questions on Rav Yosef. It drops it from 2 to 1. So maybe that's what it means. They also disagree about korban. Now you'd have to explain, well, then why didn't it mention korban? The reason why it only says the shir of shoeva is because they wanted to highlight the uniqueness of this. What's so unique about it? To show how his strength, and this is like strength of heter, right? In order to, he went so far as to permit even the musical instruments used in the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Wow, that's a big chiddush, as we said, right? To be able to say that. So therefore, they wanted to highlight that, that even the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, it overrides. That's why they mentioned shoeva. But theoretically, they really disagree about both. And that's the second small chart on the page, which is, right, Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda will say both in korban and shoeva, it overrides. And Chachamim will say in both, it doesn't override. That's what they're going to suggest right now. And that could minimize, again, it's still difficult according to Rabbi Yosef, because it still says they disagree about the shoeva one, but at least in the korban, we don't have a knockout on that element of his words. So now the Gemara says, wait, that doesn't really make sense though. Why? The hat katane, it says in our Mishnah, Zehu chalil shel simchat beit hashoeva she'ena doche lo et hashabbat v'lo et hayom tov. Zehu is a very interesting word. Zehu means this is, okay? Meaning, sounds like this and no other. So they're saying, Zehu de'eno doche. This is the chalil of the simchat beit hashoeva that doesn't override Shabbat. That seems to imply only this doesn't override Shabbat, but something else does, which now makes it very difficult because what, right? Aval de korban doche. Sounds like the korban would override. So now the question is, who does this go according to? Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda or the rabbis? So mane, inema Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. It definitely can't be Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda because according to the Braita, what do we see? He thinks that shir shel shoeva overrides Shabbat. So therefore, right? Ha'amar, shir shel shoeva nami docha. In which case, the Mishnah clearly can't be Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, because again, according to Rabbi Yirmiyah Bar Abba's reading, which the Braita supports, this Braita that said Shiur Shel Shoevad is a debate. There's a debate about this, and Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda doesn't agree with the Mishnah, which means it could only be the rabbi's approach. And again, what's clear from the Mishnah? Remember, what did we try to answer according to Rabbi Yosef? Whatever they hold for Shiur Shel Shoevad, they hold for Korban. So if the rabbis think Khalil doesn't override Shabbat and Shoeva, then it won't override it in Korban either. But that doesn't fit with the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says only Shiur Shel Shoevad doesn't override, but it implies that Korban would. So that doesn't match Rabbi Yosef's answer, at least the answer we gave for Rabbi Yosef, that maybe they disagree about both, won't really fit with our Mishnah. And that's what the Gemara says, Elalav Rabbanan, it must be the rabbis, because the Mishnah can't be Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, that for sure. If it's the rabbis, then what does it say here? Shiur Shel Shoevad doesn't override, but Shiur Shel Korban would override, which means that if that Braita that said Shiur Shel Shoevad is a machloket, it must be that both agree when it comes to Korban that it would override, in which case we have the exact flip of Rabbi Yosef, and it's a difficulty against Rabbi Yosef, both in the Shiur Shel Shoevad and both in Korban. Again, just to make a quick summary, because in Shiur Shel Shoevad, the Braita says they disagree. By Korban, they all agree. And Rabbi Yosef said they disagree about Korban and they all agree about Shoeva, which is basically the exact flip, which means that there's difficulty against Rabbi Yosef on two. And that's why it says, Tiyufta de Rabbi Yosef, B'tarte Tiyufta. And we're left with, even though yesterday we started with Rabbi Yosef, and as if he's the only show in town, today we saw that there's Rabbi Yirmiyah Bar Abba who has a different approach to him. And right, the Shiur Shel Shoevad is the disagreement, but everyone agrees in Korban it overrides. And we just proved it from our Mishnah and the other Braita. And therefore, we basically knock out Rav Yosef's approach. Now we go back as promised to see what's the root. Where do we get it from the verses about this idea of is Ikar Shira Bikli or Bepet, right? What's the main part of the music? My time demanda amal Ikar Shira Bikli dichtiv. Both are going to quote verses from Chronicles 2. Vayomer Chizkiyahu lahalot ha'olah lahamizbeach. Chizkiyahu makes this whole reformation. He fixes up the temple and they have sacrifices. And he goes to sacrifice the olah on the altar. And uba'et hachel ha'olah, as soon as they started burning the olah, hechel shir Hashem, the singing to God began. Ba'achatzotzrot. Val Yedei Klei David Melech Yisrael. So they started with the Shir Hashem and the Chatzotzrot, the trumpets, and with all the Kelim of David Melech Yisrael. So here you see, how did they do the Shir? With Kelim. It sounds like that's the main part. The one point I want to make about the Chatzotzrot, the commentaries point out, Chatzotzrot is not really a musical instrument, even though, right, we'd obviously say a trumpet's a musical instrument, but when they talk about singing, you wouldn't sing with a trumpet. A trumpet makes, you normally, especially in the temple, it was more like shofar blasts, right? Those aren't actually song. So they're specifically talking here about the kelim, about the other instruments, that provided the song. And you'll see it's more important in this next verse. My time of demand amari kar shira bepeh. So what's the other side to say, where do you get it from? Dichtiv, vayihi ke'echad lamechatzatzrim u'lemeshorerim lashmiya kol echad. Okay, this is in the dedication of the temple in the time of Shlomo. And there it says that the trumpeters and the ones who sang they would all make one sound. Okay, so there it seems that the idea is the singing. Okay, even though they talk about chatzotzrot, that's why I said chatzotzrot are musical instruments, but they're not really musical instruments for this purpose because they're more like blasts and not like music. So therefore, the song, Lashmiya Kol Echad, that voice, that's the voice, okay, because of the Meshorerim, the people who sing. So now, obviously, we're going to have to say, what does each one do with the other's verse? So, Idach Nami Hakti Vayomer Chizkiyahu. So what does he do with Chizkiyahu's pasuk, which seems to indicate musical instruments? So obviously, what will they say? Achi Kama. Hechel Shir Hashem, when the Shir Hashem began, Bepeh, and they started singing, then what happened? They made it nicer by adding musical instruments, but that was just accompaniment. But the main thing was the song. V'idachnami, what is the one who says musical instruments do with the verse? This is how you read it, and we keep going over this type of structure where they say, two things are together in a sentence. let's learn one from the other, that one is like the other. The singers are like the ones who blow the trumpets. How do they do the trumpets? With an instrument. So it's true that's not the one making the music, but when we get to the mishorim, those who sing, af mishorim bikli. Since there was an instrument used in that, there must be that the instruments were used in the other, and therefore it means singing with the musical instruments, because musical instruments are the main part. Okay, now we're moving to the next Mishnah, and we're going to describe the Simchat Beit HaShoeva ceremony. Anyone who didn't see the Simchat Beit HaShoeva celebration never saw real happiness. In other words, that is the biggest simcha that there is, the happiness that was generated by this celebration. Okay, as I mentioned a while back, I'll mention it again. Rashi connects the Simchat Beit HaShoeva clearly to Nisuch HaMayim. The Rambam connects it to the mitzvah of Simchat Yom Tov, and that it wasn't necessarily connected to the water libations. Okay, which is interesting because the name Simchat Beit HaShoeva does sound like drawing out water. But again, water is the theme of the holiday of Sukkot in general. And therefore, the Rambam has a different approach to it, which is just interesting in and of itself. Okay, this seems to imply they didn't do the Simchat Beit HaShoeva on Shabbat, because on Motzei Yantif, what would they do? Yardu le'ezrat nashim. Okay, remember the Ezrat Nashim. That's the big, right? There's two big rooms in the temple. One is the Ezrat Nashim. The second is what we call the Azara, which, if you remember, I'll just go through a little bit. It starts off with the Ezrat Yisrael. Those are the first 11 cubits into the room, which is, when you go, you're coming from the east. So first you enter the Ezrat Nashim, then you enter the Ezrat Yisrael, which is 11 cubits wide, which means that's the place where no women can go. That's why the Ezrat Nashim is called the Ezrat Nashim, not because women were there, although we'll see today that the Sukkah Beit HaShoeva, at some point in history, they were there before things changed. Then you go in, Yisraelim can go up to those 11 cubits. Past there, Yisrael can't go unless, right, both women and Yisraelim, there are certain circumstances where they can go further in if it's necessary for some sort of purpose. But normally they don't go beyond, otherwise they don't go beyond that. The next 11 cubits are called the Ezrat Kohanim, where again, Kohanim are allowed beyond that, but only if they're doing the worship or the service. If they're not doing anything, then they're not allowed beyond those 11 cubits. Beyond there, we get to the altar. Then there's between the altar and the ulam. Then there's the ulam. Then there's the heichal, the sanctuary, right? And then the kodesh kodeshim is in there. So that's the basic room that we're discussing. So on Motzei Yom Tov, okay, they would basically go to the Ezrat Nashim. Umitaknim sham tikun gadol. They would fix some structure. They would basically create a temporary structure. Okay, another temporary structure in our Masechet. They would build a temporary structure, and we're going to see later that it was to separate the men and the women, and we'll see that it kind of passed through a few different stages till they got to the final, how they would do it, and they would build this, it seems like, every year. And that was basically to separate men and women. This is the first place where we see this separation of men and women, although in tomorrow's daf, you'll see that they kind of find a source for it even in the Psukim in the Tanakh. Separation between men and women. It seems clear here that they didn't necessarily separate them for other things, because we'll see in the Gemara how they discuss it, why they decided they needed a separation here. Okay, and if your Hebrew's good, there's an article by Tanya Regev about mechitza and separation between men and women on the Hebrew side of our site. Menorot shel zahav hayusham. So now so the first thing is, right, this is the biggest happiness there is, number one. Number two, they would go and make this tikkun gadol, which the Gemara will explain. Number three, they would now light these candelabras, these menorot of zahav. This isn't the menorah that we know of. This is candelabras that were around. They had four vials, 4 areas where they could collect the oil. 4 cups, I guess you could call them. There were 4 ladders going up to each one. This I'll discuss more at length in tomorrow's daf. There were 4 young children from the Perchei Kuna. I want you to pay attention today. We're going to have a lot of different characters here. Okay, we're going to start with these Yeladim of the Perchei Kuna. We're going to move from there to different, people seem to be categorized here. And bidehem kadim shomeh ve'eschim log. They were carrying 120 log of oil, which is 50 liters. Okay, it sounds like a ton. right? Imagine trying to carry 50 liters. I'm thinking of like those guys in the army, they carry a sick amount of stuff. You'll see in the Gemara, there's going to be a discussion. Did they each carry 120 or was it all together they carried 120? Safra actually says, interestingly, it's not clear here, do they have to keep filling it up? And that if they were really doing this party all night, 50 liters wouldn't be enough for all night. And they probably had to go up multiple times, although it doesn't mention that here. So they then would pour that into each of the cups. So there were 4 kids, each pouring into a different cup for these menorot. From the remnants of the Bigdei Kuna. Remember, we discussed this in the past. At a certain point, the Bigdei Kuna, your clothes wear out, but they're sanctified. So what are you going to do with them, right? The Kohanim wore them as their clothes. So from the pants and from the belts, they would make wicks out of them. People ask questions. What about the rest of right? There's 4 Bigdei Kuna. Why only from those? Anyway, I'll leave that question aside. Mehem hayumafki'in, they would make wicks out of them. Ubehen hayumadlikim, and then they would light the wicks with them. We're going to see a lot of exaggeration in today's daf, okay? There was no courtyard in Jerusalem that didn't benefit from the great lights that they put up here at this big party. Chasidim v'anshe maaseh, here's your next category of people. Chasidim, Chasidim, right? People who take extra care with mitzvot, and anshe maaseh, people of action, okay? They would dance before them. They would dance with torches. You could see there was more light than just those menorot because all these people were dancing with torches. And then they would say songs and praises of God. Next category of people, Haleviim. Where are the Levites? Okay, infinite number of musical instruments. Okay, they'd be playing with all the different musical instruments. Where would they do this? Remember, we learned that everything was on different levels, and there were these stairs leading up from level to level. Between the Ezrat Nashim and Ezrat Yisrael were 15 steps. This is we'll see in a second, they compare it to, I'll wait to see it inside. Keneged 15 ma'alot sheb'Teilim. Right, there's the Shirei HaMa'alot in Tehillim that we're all familiar with, Shir HaMa'alot, Imamakim, Karati Hashem, and all those. So there are 15 of them, and there were 15 stairs. Okay, so they say it was Keneged, those 15 Mizmorei Tehillim. Again, I don't think that's why they built 15 stairs, but there was this connection between them. Also, the Levites sing the songs of from the Tehillim, so it makes sense, the connection. Anyway, they would stand on those 15 steps that led down from the Ezrat Yisrael to the Ezrat Nashim. So they would stand with their musical instruments and sing songs. Now 2 Kohanim would stand by the Shar, the Shar HaElyon, the upper Shar that goes down from Ezrat Yisrael to the Ezrat Nashim. And they're carrying trumpets. Someone would call out, right? They would call out, maybe the way we do in shul on Rosh Hashanah, Tkiya, Truat, it's like say, blow the trumpets, and then they would blow. So they basically start this procession, leaving right, you're getting this whole, right, it's kind of like in Yomi when we had this whole description of what exactly is going on. So they would start walking out from the Azara, they would go down the steps, they would stop at the 10th step, and then then they would blow the shofars, the trumpets again. They then get down to the Ezrat Nashim, some people have this, some people don't. They got down to the ground level. In other words, they kept walking out. As they walked, they kept blowing the trumpets until they get to the easternmost gate. They now turn their faces. In other words, Mizrach, east is out. So they now they get to the easternmost point, they turn around, they look inside the temple, basically toward the sanctuary, and they say the following statement. Avotenu shayu b'makom hazeh, our fathers who were in this place, achoreihem al ha'echal, their backs were to the hechal upneim kedman, their faces were facing east, u'mishtachavim kedman l'shemesh, and they were bowing to the sun. And that's not what we do, right? So Rashi explains, what is he talking about here? Rashi says, "B'bayit harishon ayu koflim, v'lo ayu pneihem labayit." In other words, he's kind of saying in the first temple, maybe this is why the temple was destroyed. Maybe they're saying we don't want to bring the destruction, so we're going to do things differently. And he describes these words. Achareihem alechal Hashem is a verse from Yechezkel. It's actually from here, from the word achareihem. It's all words from the pasuk in Yechezkel. And therefore, now the pasuk stops, and then he says, "Ve'anu liya'inenu." In other words, we're not doing like them. We have it right. We are turning our eyes toward you, God. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, "Hayushonim ve'omrim anu liya'inenu." He says they would say a double language, which is, I am to you, and to you my eyes are facing. It's almost like saying my heart is to you and my eyes are to you, or something like that. But we're all with you. Now, the Gemara is going to start off and say, we're going to bring another brayta that talks about Mishalo Ra'ah, whoever didn't see the Simcha Pedash Shoeva, never saw happiness in its life. And then it's going to bring a whole slew of other ones. The last one's going to be a particularly interesting one about if you've never seen this, then you've never seen it. So, Tanu Rabbanit, Mishalo Ra'ah Simcha Pedash Shoeva, Lo Ra'ah Simcha Miyamav, same thing we already saw. We've never seen real happiness. Which is nice, by the way, that they really give a full description of it, so you could try to envision it as best as you can. Whoever never saw Jerusalem in its glory, never saw a beautiful city. Anyone who never saw the Beit HaMikdash in its building, which we're going to see what exactly does that mean, and maybe that's because they don't exactly understand bivinyano. They're going to basically say, let's try to explain what exactly is this referring to, because it seems pretty simple, but the Gemara is going to ask and answer, so we'll see. If you never saw Beit HaMikdash in its building, or as it was built, lo ra'a binyan mefo'ar me'olam, they never saw such a glorious building in their lives. Maihi, so what is this? So again, why ask specifically about the Beit HaMikdash? Unclear, but maybe because of that word bibinyano. Amar Abaye, V'itema Rav Chisda, one of them, either Abaye or Rav Chisda, said, Ze binyan Hordus. This is Hordus's building, right? Herod's temple, because, right, the temple was built, it was by Rishon, the first temple, there was by Sheni, that was built by Nehemiah, and then, or in the time of Nehemiah, then after that, Herod made a whole, right, he revamped the temple, and they're saying that's what we're talking about, was amazingly glorious. B'mai, now we want to know, B'mai Banya, what did he build it with? So, Amarava ba'avne shisha u'mirmira, either colored stones, the Quran says green, gray, Rashi says colored, not stones, right, marble, right, I guess it's stones really, right, stones that were made of this greenish gray marble, u'mirmira, which is white marble. It was blue and white, it sounds like kachol lavan. Apik safa va'ayal safa. So he made these rows of stones. It would go up one and in one. Kiechi de the kabel sida, so that it was easier for it to accept the limestone covering they would put on them. Savar lemishye bedava. He wanted to cover them with gold, because right, why not make it as glorious as possible? Always cover it with gold. Amrule Rabbanan shavke, leave it. Don't cover them with gold. Dahas shapir tfei, because it's better like this. Demichse ka'advata diyam. It looks like the waves of the sea. This is where we talk about the tchelet, it sounds like also, about the blue and this idea of it looking like the sea. So that's a better way, to leave it like that. The gold is very pretty, but this has a nicer image. Tanya, here comes the really interesting source. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mi shelo ra'a diupluston shel Alexandria shel Mitzrayim lo ra'a b'chodan shel Yisrael. If you never saw the temple in Alexandria, the Beit HaKnesset, they built this unbelievable shul that looked like the temple. Okay, and it's called Dioplustin. Rashi says Dio is right, it's two. Plustin is like I think he says it's like city. Where was it? Dioshnayim Plu Lashon Sarim. It's like officers, like a metropolitan, right? He says like that, and it basically is saying. And stone is Lashon Stav, which, remember the colonnades in the temple. There were 2 rows of them. This is saying there were 2 rows of these colonnades. It was a very fancy building. And you never saw the glory of the Jewish people. Okay, this is right. This is like I'm imagining. You go sometimes, right, in Israel, they don't really have these glorious shul buildings, but sometimes you're outside of Israel and you go to some shul and it's unbelievably gorgeous. That's what this sounds like, okay? And I specifically say outside of Israel because you're going to see that's really the theme here. Amru kimim basilica gdola. It was like a basilica. Stav lifnim mistav. It had these rows of colonnades like in the temple, right? It really sounds like the temple. Pa'amim shayu ba kiflaim kiotzei mitzrayim. Sometimes there were times where it had 120,000 people. Okay, double the amount of people who came out of Egypt, right? Again, sounds very temple-like, okay? Becky, hold off on your thought, just wait. There were 71 golden chairs. Keneged, what's 71? Keneged, the way the big Sanhedrin, right? It really sounds like the temple. The temple also had the Sanhedrin sitting there in there. So they had these golden thrones, so to speak, that had, there were 71 of them, like the Sanhedrin. Okay, again, a bit of exaggeration here. None of them, right, even the 120,000 people was, I'm sure, exaggeration. And none of them had less than 120,000 kikarim, that's a money of gold. Okay, they were made of tons of gold, each chair, right? Again, very exaggerated. There was a bima, stand of wood. The Chazan Knesset Omed Aleh, the Chazan would stand there. Again, I was just in a shul in America, right? They every 2 minutes they announce the page, right? Or so here the Chazan Knesset standing there. Sudarim biyado, he has a sheet in his hand or a scarf in his hand. Kevan shigia lanon amen halam enif besudar v'kol amonim amen. Okay, again, you get this, right? This very glorious, this person standing there was telling everybody what to do, when to do it. Okay, answer amen now. They wouldn't sit together. Now, this doesn't mean men and women. This is very interesting. Everybody sat according to their job. Okay, so the goldsmiths, the silversmiths, the glass blowers, I forgot the tarsim, what they are, and the gardim or the weavers. Okay, everybody sat according to their job. Now, why is this important, right? It seems weird. We don't sit in shul like that. But this beautiful idea. A poor person would walk into shul looking for a job. He doesn't have work. So he goes to wherever his skill set is. He finds the people who do what he does. And he would go and get a job, right? This is the first source for, right? The shul is a place to I'm forgetting my words, to, connect with other people. And I'm forgetting the word that I'm trying to use, but right. Shul is a place where people do business and people make all their connections and network. Thank you, Julie. I don't know why I couldn't find that word in my head, right? It's networking. This is it. This is a great source for it. Okay. So now, right, if you ever think it's bad here, well, although you'll see that this is obviously a very beautiful idea, but because it's obviously helping all the poor people, but we're going to see something goes bad here. So this sounds like a beautiful thing. Next line is Amar Abaye v'kulu katlinu Alexandros Mokdon. Alexander Mokdon came and murdered them all. My time Yanshu, what were they punished for? Mishum de'avde avre ahadcha. They went against this verse. Lo tosifun lashuv baderech hazeh. This is what you said, Becky, right? You're not allowed to go back to Egypt. What were they doing? Not only going back to Egypt, but establishing a temple that looked like our temple with the Sanhedrin almost. What were you doing, right? And this sounds like, right, well, those people who get too comfortable outside of Israel, right, the danger of making everything so comfortable and so perfect. And so this, right, God kind of says, this isn't what the idea I had in mind, right? The inu or hadarate, and they went back to Egypt. Ki ata, right, so you could say this is only about Egypt possibly, but maybe not. Ki ata ashkachinu davakare b'sifra. Now the question is, what made him decide that this is the time I should destroy the people? What was going on in his mind? So when he got there, he saw them reading a book, and they were reading in the Torah, and they said the pasuk, Yisa Shem Alecha Goy Merachok, God is going to bring an enemy from afar, and it says there he's going to be like a nesher, okay, which is like a griffin vulture, okay, so which comes very fast, swoops down. Amar, so he said to himself, Generally, the travel I just did, it takes an average person 10 days. But Dalia Zika, there was a big wind. And I made it in 5 days. He said, I must be that Nesher. So Nafal Alayu Bekatzlinu. He attacked them and he killed them all. Okay, interesting story. Possibly messages to be derived from there. Okay, last part for today. B'motzei Yom Tov, they made this tikkun gadol. My tikkun gadol. Amar Rabbi Elazar, kotash shaninu. As we learned in a Braita, chalakai tabarishona, the walls were smooth. B'kifua gezuztra, but then they kind of put something jutting out. They built a platform basically that was higher than in the Ezrat Nashim, and then there was a place for the women to go up above. Right? Hikifua gezuztra v'itkinu shiu nashim yashvot milamala v'nashim milamata. This sounds like what we have in shuls, that women are in the balcony and men are below. Tanu Rabbanan, right? Nowadays, it's much more common when people are building new shuls to try to build it where women are alongside men, at least in certain places. But you do see here the source, women above, men below, right? Although obviously nowadays there's other considerations, which is women feel like they're far away and they want to be part of the davening. Tanu Rabbanan. So now we get a little bit of history here and we'll end with that. But Rishonayu Nashim Bifnim, Vanashim Bachutz. The women were inside the Ezrat Nashim and the men were standing outside, which is interesting because they're like more closer to the action. What happened? But it caused all sorts of problems, right? Maybe the women were in the Ezrat Nashim because it was smaller and the big courtyard of the Har Habayit had more space. So maybe that's why the men were there. But then the men were kind of looking in toward the Heichal where things are, and they would look at the women. It wasn't a good thing. Led to, people intermingling. They didn't like that. So then they said, okay, women outside, men inside. That way the men's heads are turned that way, won't be a problem. But that didn't work either. So therefore they basically switched it and they said, okay, women above, men below, and that way there'll be less interaction between them. Again, you see, they only did this in the Sukkah Shoeva, which was a big fun party kind of celebration. You could see why it makes sense there. Although, as I said in tomorrow's daf, we're going to see a pasuk that actually talks about separation between men and women. Okay, the last question I'll leave you with is, how could they have built some structure in the temple? The plans of the temple were decided by God. They were passed down by God. You can't change them. So how could they possibly have changed them? Leave you with that question. And with that, wish everyone a Shabbat Shalom.